On the morning of April 23, 1945, the air in the dense Bavarian forest near the Czech border was freezing, crisp, and supposed to smell like spring. Instead, for the men of the United States 90th Infantry Division, the vanguard of General George S. Patton's Third Army, the wind carried a scent that none of them would ever be able to wash out of their clothes or their memories for the rest of their lives. It was the heavy, sweet, sickening metallic smell of industrialized death. They had just stumbled into Flossenburg. History books often sanitize this day. They give you the date, they give you the troop movements, the coordinates, and the official, neatly typed casualty reports. But they deliberately leave out what happens to the human soul when a 19-year-old American farm boy from Ohio, who has spent the last year surviving artillery barrages and machine gun nests, walks through a set of iron gates and finds thousands of unburied skeletal corpses stacked like firewood outside a granite quarry. And more importantly, the polite, sanitized versions of American history leave out exactly what General George S. Patton did when his men dragged the captured SS commanders of that camp out of the surrounding woods. Commanders who, despite standing in an ocean of their own victims' blood, still had the absolute, unbelievable audacity to demand they be treated as honorable prisoners of war. Type the year 1945 in the comments right now if you are ready to witness the exact moment the Nazi delusion of a master race was completely, violently, and permanently shattered by a United States general who had officially run out of patience. Because what George Patton did at Flossenburg wasn't just a military operation. It was a biblical reckoning. To understand the sheer, explosive gravity of the collision that was about to happen between Patton and the SS, you cannot just look at the moment itself. You have to understand the specific, unique flavor of hell that Flossenburg was, and you have to understand the specific psychological breaking point of the American soldiers who found it. According to the official combat chronicles of the 90th Infantry Division, a unit known as the Tough Hombres because of their incredibly high casualty rates and ferocious combat record from Normandy to the Bulge, these American GIs were not easily shocked. They were hardened combat veterans. They had seen their friends blown apart. They had seen cities leveled to ash. They thought they understood exactly how ugly human beings could be to one another. But according to the oral histories preserved by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, nothing in their brutal combat experience prepared them for Flossenburg. This was not a standard prisoner of war camp. This was an extermination through labor camp. Built intentionally around a massive, unforgiving granite quarry, its sole purpose was to work human beings, political prisoners, Jews, captured Allied intelligence operatives, and dissidents, until their bodies simply consumed themselves for energy and gave out. By the time Patton's Third Army breached the outer perimeter on April 23rd, the SS guards realized that the 1,000-year Reich was collapsing around them. But true to the fundamentally cowardly nature of the ideology they served, these elite SS men didn't stand and fight the heavily armed American combat troops. Instead, they initiated a forced death march. They forced thousands of starving, freezing, dying prisoners out into the freezing Bavarian mud to walk until their hearts stopped, while the SS officers themselves frantically stripped off their identifying insignia. They changed into regular Wehrmacht uniforms, stole civilian clothes, or simply ran like frightened animals into the woods, hoping to blend in with the retreating population. But the men of the 90th Infantry Division were not in a forgiving mood. The American GIs who walked into Flossenburg and saw the crematorium ovens still radiating heat and the bodies still bleeding in the dirt were completely traumatized and utterly, dangerously enraged. They did not wait for military police. They hunted the surrounding woods with a cold, terrifying, hyper-focused efficiency. Within hours, they had tracked down and dragged dozens of SS guards, administrators, and high-ranking camp commanders back through the front gates. And this is where the profound, deeply ingrained psychological sickness of the Nazi regime truly revealed itself. According to the interrogation reports and operational diaries maintained by the Third Army headquarters, when these SS commanders were captured, they did not act like men who had just been caught running a mechanized slaughterhouse. They acted annoyed. They were visibly irritated that they were being handled roughly by enlisted American troops. They stood in the center of the camp, surrounded by the rotting, undeniable physical evidence of their own unspeakable crimes, and they have the sheer sociopathic gall to demand their rights under the Geneva Conventions. They smoothed down their tunics. They demanded to speak to an American officer of equal rank. They demanded clean quarters, warm food, and the professional respect that the rules of war afford to captured soldiers. They legitimately believed that because they wore a uniform, they were immune from the consequences of their actions. Type the word hell in the comments if your blood is boiling just imagining the sheer, unadulterated arrogance of these men standing in a graveyard of their own making and demanding VIP treatment from the men who just liberated it. The American enlisted soldiers didn't shoot them. They desperately wanted to. Every natural, human instinct in their bodies told them to raise their M1 Garands, flit the safety off, and end the SS bloodline right there in the dirt. But they didn't. They held their fire because word had come rapidly down the chain of command that the commanding general of the Third Army was on his way to inspect the camp personally. And nobody, not even a combat-hardened GI, wanted to rob George S. Patton of what was coming. When General Patton's convoy arrived at Flossenburg, the atmospheric pressure of the entire region seemed to drop by 10 degrees. Patton was already a man fundamentally altered by what he had seen in the preceding weeks. According to the deeply personal diary entries detailed in Martin Blumenson's definitive work, The Patton Papers, the general's experiences at the Ohrdruf and Buchenwald camps had broken something inside him. The aggressive, bombastic cavalryman who wrote poetry about the glory of battle had died in those camps. What replaced him was a man vibrating with a cold, ruthless, terrifying moral clarity. Patton stepped out of his jeep. He didn't look at the SS commanders waiting in the holding area. He ignored them completely. First, he walked the camp. Accompanied by his senior staff, Patton walked through the wooden barracks, where living men were stuffed into wooden shelves like rotting inventory, covered in typhus, feces, and open sores. He walked to the edge of the granite quarry, where thousands of men had been beaten to death, carrying stones up the steps. He stood in front of the crematoriums, looking at the ash that coated the ground like gray snow. And just as he had done at Ohrdruf weeks earlier, Patton, the toughest, most fiercely masculine combat general in the United States military, a man who had seen decades of war, walked over to the side of a building, leaned against the wood, and violently vomited. He didn't hide it. He didn't wipe his mouth quickly and pretend he was fine for the sake of his men. According to the memoirs of his staff officers, Patton let his men see that the horror was real, that it was completely acceptable for a human being to be physically sickened by it, and that the appropriate response to this level of evil was total biological rejection. And then he composed himself. He stood up straight. He adjusted his polished helmet. He rested his hands on the grips of his famous ivory-handled revolvers, and he walked directly toward the holding area where the SS commanders were waiting. The senior captured SS officer, seeing a 3-star American general approaching, immediately snapped to rigid attention. He kicked his polished boots together, raised his chin, threw his shoulders back, and prepared to introduce himself military to military. He was expecting the polite, professional courtesy that senior officers historically extended to one another, even in total defeat. He was expecting the brotherhood of arms. Patton did not salute back. He did not speak a word of greeting. He walked up to the SS commander, moving with deliberate, predatory slowness, and stopped so incredibly close that the brim of his American helmet nearly touched the German's forehead. According to the accounts of the Third Army staff officers present, Patton looked at the man's face as if he were observing a diseased insect that had just crawled out of an open sewer. The SS officer, suddenly realizing that the standard military protocols were not going to protect him, that the invisible shield of his rank was dissolving under Patton's glare, nervously began to speak. He stated his rank. He claimed, as they all did, that he was merely an administrator. He claimed that he was a professional soldier of the German state, merely following the lawful orders of his superiors, and that as a prisoner of war, he was protected by international law and immune from arbitrary punishment. Patton let him finish. He let the SS officer expend all his oxygen on excuses. And then, George Patton completely dismantled the man's entire universe. Speaking in that distinct, high-pitched, raspy voice that commanded hundreds of thousands of men, Patton informed the SS commander that he was fundamentally, fatally mistaken about his current status. Patton told him, leaning in so the SS officer could smell the tobacco and leather on him, that the Geneva Conventions were drafted to protect soldiers. They were written for men who fought in the mud, who faced enemy artillery fire, who carried weapons against other men with weapons, and who operated within the boundaries of human honor. Patton then raised a single leather-gloved finger and pointed past the SS officer's shoulder, directly at the mountains of emaciated corpses stacked behind them. He told the SS officer that the men who did that were not soldiers. They were not combatants. They were not military officers. They were butchers. And according to the historical accounts of what Patton said that day, he made it explicitly clear: butchers do not get military courtesy. Butchers do not get honorable prisoner of war status. Butchers get treated exactly like the degenerate, soulless criminals they are. Type the word "break" in the comments right now if you can feel the exact terrifying moment that Nazi officer realized his rank, his tailored uniform, and his arrogant excuses meant absolutely zero to the American general standing in front of him. But Patton wasn't done. Words were not enough for what the Third Army had found at Flossenburg. Patton understood something deeply profound about human psychology, the nature of evil, and the mechanics of true justice. He knew that you could not just process these men administratively. You could not just lock them in a cell and wait for lawyers to figure it out. You had to physically, aggressively shatter the delusion of their supremacy. You had to make them literally touch the reality of their own evil. Patton issued a command that sent a shockwave of absolute silence through the camp. According to the directives recorded by his staff, Patton ordered the heavily armed American military police to march the SS commanders, the camp guards, and the local German townspeople who had continuously claimed they didn't know what was happening up the hill, directly into the blood-soaked center of the camp. He ordered them to dig massive graves in the hard, frozen Bavarian earth. But he didn't just make them dig. Patton commanded that the SS officers, these arrogant, pristine men who had spent 12 years treating Jewish people, political prisoners, and Allied POWs as subhuman garbage, were to go to the piles of the dead. He ordered that they were not allowed to use gloves. They were not allowed to use shovels to move the bodies. They were not allowed to use stretchers or carts. Patton ordered the SS commanders to use their own bare hands. He ordered them to reach into the piles, pick up the rotting, typhus-ridden, emaciated bodies of the people they had murdered, carry them in their own arms to the graves they had just dug, and lay them down with the dignity and respect they had completely denied them in life. The SS officers hesitated. They looked at the bodies, then at the mud, then at their uniforms. One of the senior SS men actually began to object, citing the extreme health hazards of handling typhus victims, citing the degradation of a commissioned officer being forced to do manual grave-digging labor. Patton didn't even raise his voice to yell. He simply unclasped the leather strap on his holster, freeing his revolver. He looked at the American GIs surrounding the SS, men whose eyes were completely dead, men who had their fingers resting white-knuckled on the triggers of their Thompson submachine guns, men who were silently praying, begging for a reason to squeeze those triggers. Patton looked back at the complaining SS commander and told him with a voice as cold as the grave that he had a very simple choice. He could either pick up the bodies right now, or he could join them in the pile. They picked up the bodies. For hours, the SS commanders in their formerly pristine, tailored uniforms waded through the filth, the blood, and the absolute horror of their own making. Their uniforms were ruined, soaked in the bodily fluids of their victims. Their hands were stained black and red. The sweet, sickening stench of death seeped deep into their skin, into their hair, into their pores. They wept. The master race broke down and sobbed. They vomited onto their own boots. They collapsed in the mud from the physical and psychological exhaustion of carrying the dead. And every single time an SS officer fell, the American soldiers forced them right back up to their feet at gunpoint and made them keep going. Patton stood there in the courtyard and watched them do it. He didn't leave. He stood like an immovable statue of iron and made sure they felt every single ounce of the humiliation, the terror, and the absolute crushing degradation they had inflicted on hundreds of thousands of innocent human beings. He forced the architects of the Holocaust to become the weeping gravediggers for the very people they had tried to erase from the earth. This is the side of World War II that the polished, polite documentaries often gloss over. We talk endlessly about the Nuremberg trials, about the meticulous judges, the brilliant lawyers, and the international legal tribunals that happened years later in clean, well-lit courtrooms. And those trials were absolutely necessary for the establishment of international law and the historical record. But the law is slow. The law is clinical. The law is a process of paperwork and debate. What General George S. Patton delivered at Flossenburg on April 23, 1945, was not the law. It was pure, unadulterated, righteous justice. The survivors of Flossenburg, the walking skeletons who sat shivering in the dirt wrapped in olive-drab American Army blankets, didn't need to see a courtroom in Nuremberg 3 years later. They needed to see the men who had tortured them, starved them, and murdered their families broken in the mud, right then and there. They needed to see that the monsters could be brought to heel. They needed to see the SS commanders weeping like children as they carried the dead. Patton gave them that. He gave the victims the one thing that no international court, no lawyer, and no treaty ever could: the immediate, undeniable physical proof that the evil had been utterly defeated, and that the monsters were just weak, pathetic, cowardly men when the institutional power was finally stripped away from them. Type the word justice in the comments right now if you believe that making those SS commanders carry and bury the dead with their bare hands was the absolute most correct, most necessary order General Patton could have given that day. History is not just a dusty collection of dates to be memorized. It is a living record of human extremes. It shows us the deepest, darkest pits of depravity we are capable of, and it shows us the most towering, awe-inspiring moments of moral clarity. What happened in the mud at Flossenburg is a permanent, blazing reminder that true evil cannot be reasoned with, it cannot be negotiated with, and it certainly does not deserve the protection of our polite protocols. It must be met with absolute, uncompromising strength, and it must be violently forced to face the reality of its own reflection. If this story made you feel the true, heavy weight of what those American farm boys in the 90th Infantry Division accomplished when they walked into the mouth of hell in the spring of 1945, do one thing before you close this app or scroll away. Hit the like button. Do not do it for any social media algorithm. Do it as a digital monument to the soldiers who walked into the darkness and dragged the devil out by his throat so the rest of the world could survive. Subscribe to this channel if you are hungry for the raw, unfiltered, deeply human history that standard, polite textbooks are too afraid to print. Turn on your notifications so you never miss a historical reckoning like this one. And leave your honest thoughts in the comments below, because the conversation this community builds in the comment section is the best historical archive on the internet, and I read every single one of your words. I will see you in the next one.